All righty. Welcome, everyone. I think we are live. Welcome to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. I'm your host, Carter Laren, and I am joined, as always, by the bad man, Majama, Keri Smith. Keri.
Hi. I feel like I just saw you.
You did, although they don't know that because we haven't actually published Kofefi from this morning yet. We are just too busy. Someday we will be rolling in the cash and we'll have someone who does video editing all the time. And Keri and I will just focus on content. But right now, we're in startup mode. So we would be cleaning the bathrooms if we had bathrooms, but we don't. We don't even have an office. But yeah, it's good. We should probably give a quick synopsis of what we're doing with Deprogrammed generally. First of all, I think it's going to kind of permanently switch to 10 a.m. Pacific time. For those of you who are used to 11 a.m. Pacific time, sorry, but this is what we got. So we're working with what we got. So 10 a.m. Pacific time. We could theoretically switch the day. So, again, our audience isn't that big. So if you guys have preferences for days, if they can work with schedules, then we can switch days. But as of now, I think we're switching to 10 a.m. Pacific time for Deprogrammed. Also, although we do like interviewing people, and we are going to have, we have several people lined up, and we're going to continue to do interviews. A lot of them, I think, are going to be not part of Deprogrammed, because what Keri and I really want to have Deprogrammed super focused on is this unraveling the social justice ideology. And
yes, and that's how this started.
Yeah,
this is more about as we've said, it's about untangling my old ideology episode by episode and trying to make it more understandable, not just for myself and for Carter, but for anybody who is just coming into contact with it, maybe because they have a loved one who has started espousing some of these tenets, talking about male privilege or toxic masculinity or white fragility or whatever. So yeah, we really want to just keep it focused on SJW stuff. And so a lot of the people that recently we were talking about booking don't really fall into this category. We will have guests again. It's just
yeah, but we will have guests that aren't focused on this particular topic, right? We don't want to be stuck shoehorning people into talking about social justice when that's not really what their area of expertise or not where the conversation's going. And plus, I really enjoyed. Thank you, Pete. This description still says 11. I'll change that. But I really enjoyed last week. I found it really helpful to go through Peggy McIntosh's Knapsack article, and we realized that we have this great resource in Keri, who is a trained expert in all of this stuff. So we really should use you more, Keri. You've got books that you read in college and courses you took and knowledge of stuff that, you said when you said to me, hey, do you know Simone de Beauvoir? And I was like, I don't know. I have no idea who that is. But maybe I should. So that's what we're doing. So today we're going to walk through, or we're not going to walk through a whole book. We're going to talk about her book called The Second Sex.
Right. It would be a little hard to do just in an hour and a half. Also, I haven't read the book in 20 years. I've just gone through the Cliff Notes with you to try to prepare for this.
Read some excerpts, went through the Cliff Notes.
Yes.
But you have read the book, just not recently.
Yes. So she was a French existentialist and feminist.
In the 40s, right?
In the 40s, right. And so this book that she wrote called The Second Sex in 1949 is the basis of a lot of feminist theory and is one of the must-read books if you're taking women's studies. She's one of the ones who helped to promote this idea that gender is a social construct, that sex is a social construct. So some of that, if you trace its roots back, goes back to this book, which was divided into two books. It was 2 volumes.
Now she was, is she kind of, my understanding is she's kind of considered an early founder of second wave feminism, even though second wave feminism really didn't come into its own until the 60s. She was kind of the one of the early kind of founders of that movement. Is that correct, or that school of thought?
Correct. Because
Okay.
I think about, at least the way I was taught in women's studies, first wave feminism was more about attaining equal rights under the law, right? So you think of suffragettes, people who are out there saying women deserve the right to vote. Second wave feminism is what we think of. It's like the 1960s, the bra burning, which supposedly didn't happen, but that's what we think of. We think second wave feminism was more about equality in culture and in society. So there was another important book that we should look at, which I have read more recently, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. That was another one that kind of laid the groundwork, I would say, for second wave feminism.
So this book, I mean, something that stood out.
And then just quickly, and then third wave feminism came about when I was in college. Yeah, third wave was it started off as I don't know. It's really different. They argue now on what wave we're in. Are we still in third wave? Or are we in fourth wave? Who knows? But third wave was more of like, this idea. At least when I 20 years ago, third wave was all about like the riot girl movement. It was throwing off standards of beauty, but at the same time, embracing certain traditional standards of beauty and saying, I can wear lipstick and high heels, and I can act out these gender norms that some of the second wavers rejected, or that radical feminists.
Like what third wavers, like not anti-porn, where second wavers were anti-porn. Is that?
For the most part, there are people who don't, fall into those generalizations. But yeah, for the most part, you would see third wavers were like sex positive, right? That's when you started seeing all this stuff about like sex workers and being pro porn. And
now arguing about what wave of feminism we're in at this point is kind of like, I don't know.
What wave of
when
hell?
You're eating yourself, what course of dinner is that? Is that the third course or the fourth course? I don't know.
What circle of hell are we in?
Yeah. Now, one thing that struck me about this is there are a few things just off the top. One is she used a phrase which I kind of thought was a new phrase, but we even talked about it earlier this week that a politician used, lived experience. Is this where it came from?
I'm pretty sure this is where it came from. Don't quote me on that. But yes, it's much older than you think, because she divided the second sex into two volumes, Facts and Myths, and then Lived Experience. It is an old feminist concept.
I was not aware of that. The other thing that I noticed is she kind of explicitly says, what's the phrase? Let me find the phrase. She says, women can only achieve total freedom while working if she's in a socialist society, which gives you a hint right away that something's wrong, because to use the word freedom and socialist society in the same sentence indicates some sort of misunderstanding of one of those concepts, at least. But
and it also directly shows you the relationship to Marxism.
Yes,
the relationship here to that ideal. We call, and I just was in an argument with someone earlier today on social media who just doesn't. I'm continually amazed by people who are like, "What are you talking about, Marxism? This is just progressivism." And I'm like, we don't teach people enough about Marxism. Okay, so people have no idea that this thing they're out there preaching is a very old concept. But yes, I like this because she's very blatantly showing the connection there.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, I actually had a quick discussion with someone on Twitter today who was arguing that it wasn't actually Marxism. It was really more like the Bismarck method. But my view on this, we do use the word Marxism a little bit sloppily, not just us, everyone. The truth is, it's collectivist totalitarian ideology. Now, there's lots of flavors of that.
Yes.
But Marxism is kind of a broad term you can use. I don't really care what flavor of totalitarian regime is being pushed. So it's to me, it's like fighting over exactly how to call some hybrid of a bunch of things isn't really that important. The point is, there are authoritarians who do believe in, who have a collectivist philosophical ideology. And their implementations may vary, but that's what they want to replace individualism with. And that's very clear to me.
And it's the closest ideology that you can point to in history that to give you a blueprint for what it is. I mean, it's focused on power and hierarchy, which is what Marxism was focused on. It's just that they define where you get your power in a different way. You get your power from what identity groups you're in.
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit with her. There's something she's actually hard. I think de Beauvoir is a little bit harder to analyze for a couple reasons. One is there's context, there's historical context, which is much different than today. I mean, she wrote this in the 40s, right? Mm-hmm. It was published in 1949. You got to figure she's writing it mid 40s. The culture was a lot different. So some of the things that she's pushing against today, I was reading and thinking like, well, that doesn't happen. Like, that's not how marriage is. That's not how people treat each other. That's not how relationships are. But it may have been.
Yeah. I actually don't
disagree
with her on a lot of things. I mean, some things I do, but.
Right. I disagree with her approach, though, which we'll get to. The other thing that struck me as odd is she explicitly said happiness isn't her goal for women, freedom is. And if you notice, freedom is the term that I said I'm not sure she has a full grasp of because she uses it while supporting socialism. So I'm not sure what exactly she means by freedom, but I think that we can take her at face value that happiness is not her goal. And Keri, before we even dive into this, I pulled up a couple studies that I just want to throw out there so people are aware of this. It's inarguable that feminism has achieved many of its goals. I know that third and fourth and N wave feminism thinks there's a lot more that needs to be done, but a lot of these goals have been achieved, and society has at the very least shifted much more towards at least second wave feminist mindset than in the 1940s when she was writing this. And let's take a quick look. I'm just going to cite two studies. Let's take a quick look at how women's happiness is in the West. One study is by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers from the Wharton School in Pennsylvania, and it's called The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness. I'm just going to read a little bit from the abstract. Actually, the whole abstract is pretty good and it's short. By many objective measures, the lives of women in the United States have improved over the past 35 years. Yet we show that measures of subjective well-being indicate that women's happiness, has declined both absolutely and relative to men, which is weird because male suicide is on the rise. So women are doing even worse. The paradox of women's declining relative well-being is found across various data sets, measures of subjective well-being, and is pervasive across demographic groups and industrialized countries. Relative declines in female happiness have eroded a gender gap in happiness in which women in the 1970s typically reported higher subjective well-being than did men. These declines have continued, and a new gender gap is emerging, one with higher subjective well-being for men. Okay, so happiness wasn't her goal, and it was not achieved.
Yeah, and it was not achieved, yes.
Win. The second study I want to point out, just in case people are aware of it, I'm not going to read this abstract because it is very clunky. I don't know if maybe this is translated from another language originally. I don't think so, because these people are from Missouri.
By the way, just a quick aside, the other book I mentioned, The Feminist Mystique by Betty Friedan.
Yep.
In that book, she talks a lot about the problem that has no name, is what she calls it. And it's this malaise that women have, that homemakers have, because they haven't achieved cultural and social equality, and they have to be homemakers, and they're locked into this gender role that's socially constructed, et cetera, et cetera. And if the idea is if we could break out of this, then women would be happier.
Right.
But they're not.
But women have been breaking out, and they are not happier. So the other study, I just really quickly, it's called The Gender Equality Paradox in STEM Education. And this is by someone from the School of Social Sciences at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds, and also someone in Missouri. So University of Missouri. Their finding here was interesting. So STEM is the science, technology, engineering, math that we're kind of pushing women have to do, or girls should do more of this. We're trying to get more women in STEM. That's a thing. And what they noticed is that although girls can do STEM, and achieve and can be just as good at, or if not better than some boys in the studies, what they noticed was that the more national gender equity there was, the less women wanted to do STEM in the first place. So women are selecting out of STEM given gender equality. Like, given the opportunity, they're selecting out more. The more we're pushing for equality, the less they want to be there. Does that make sense? Kind of?
It does. It actually makes me think of a study that Jordan Peterson cites a lot. I think it was a different one, but it was about, the most egalitarian societies where there's the most equality culturally and socially and legally between men and women, that there's an even greater sex selection among careers, where you see women choosing to go into caretaker roles and making up the majority of the caretaking professions, and men going into STEM and being most of the engineers, et cetera.
Right. So, Keri, I don't know where you want to start with this. We can kind of dive in. I've got some notes. I'm happy to say some stuff, but you're more the expert. So if you have a direction you want to approach this in.
I wouldn't call me an expert. I'd say that my lived experience.
Oh my God.
This is kind of like I was saying to you right before we started going live, this is kind of a large book in retrospect. Like, would you want to just start going through the chapters? Like, where do your notes start?
I do have chapter notes. Notes.
Really quickly, one other quick thing that she's known for, this is a quote that people may have heard of hers, is one of her most famous quotes is that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
Right.
And that's sort of the basis of a lot of gender theory. A lot of what we see now, having evolved into trans theory, can be traced back to that idea that there's no biological basis for what we know of as woman, that it's all a social construction. But
yeah, actually, before I make my broad point, let me say something about that, because you're spot on, and I was surprised at the non-scientific nature of her argument. She basically appeared to look at other species and say, well, not every species reproduces sexually, and which is like, yes, but we're humans, lady. So like, not every species, not all species breathe air. That's true, but we're humans. So not every species. So that's one of her arguments, that why like the sexual dichotomy isn't natural. And the other thing that she says is, well, because hermaphrodites exist, therefore it's not a natural state to have men and women, which is like so unscientific and retarded. Only an existentialist could come up with it. So I just want to cite that she makes that argument that we think is ridiculous and modern. She's making in 1949, right? And she's basically saying, because, and I'm going to use the word deformity not as a moral judgment, but if you're born with 6 fingers, that's a deformity. Humans, your DNA intends for there to be 5 fingers. I mean, that's the norm, right? That's, most people have 5 fingers. That's why, right? So if you're born with 6 fingers, or an odd tumor on your head, or a missing limb, or a hermaphrodite, that is a deformity. It's an outlier from a deformity only in the sense of the word that it is an outlier from the genetic blueprint for what typifies a human being. So the fact that there are outliers is not an argument against the overall categorization of someone as a human, right? Or as a human or that humans have gender, or that humans have, no one would argue humans don't have hands because sometimes people are born without hands. That's not an argument.
No, I appreciate that you did that. Well, the other thing that she talks about pretty early on is this idea of women being the other. And
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Please, yes, because that's the other thing I want to talk about. Yes,
that's the other thing. Ha. Okay.
Yes.
Well, that's a concept that continues to this day. You will see SJWs using that phrase to this day. It stuck. This idea that groups of people can be defined in opposition to other groups of people. So her argument, and the argument is basically the way that it's transformed to the way that you see it reflected in SJW ideology today is that any of these so-called marginalized groups that they put people in are treated as the other, not as the norm, right? So that's where the term heterosexist came from, for example, because they're like, well, we treat heterosexuals, we treat straight people as the norm. Therefore, that means we necessarily treat gay people as the other. And she posits that anytime there are two different groups and one has some kind of advantage, that they necessarily oppress the other. That they can't just have.
Considering she believes male and female are social constructs, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah. So I don't agree with that premise there, that there's that men have some advantages. Let's say as a group on the whole, in general, men have some advantages over women, physical advantages, for example, in let's say when they're running track, or those advantages don't necessarily mean that they oppress women.
Right.
I don't agree with that premise. So
of course not. Are you familiar with, so this other thing made me, when I'm saying other in capitals, this concept of the other made me think about something that's really bothering me about this approach generally. You're familiar with like the idea of like relative motion of two objects, right? If you're on a train going one way and I'm on a train going the other way, we have like speed relative to each other. And if there's no third party, if there's no background and there's no external frame of reference, we don't really know. There's like our speed can only be measured relatively. We can't say that train is going fast because we don't really know. We only know it's going fast in one direction relative to us. We don't know anything about the external frame of reference, right?
Right.
So I know that's a weird analogy to bring up, but it's related sort of metaphorically to how I think she's viewing humans as a species. Because when I look at humans, I think, okay, well, roughly 50% of them are female and roughly 50% are male. Now, let's assume, this isn't true, but let's assume that each has their own complete society and culture, right? And they overlap just a slight way, and they interact a little bit, right? It's as if this one group, this member of this one group, this woman, Simone, is saying, well, all of society is that other group's perspective. And we're their other. And blah, 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 blah. And my reaction to this approach is I could write a 2-volume book about how women view men as the other. And how all the society of women, and because women have their own social organizations and social constructs, and they're, you go to women's Bible studies and women's knitting classes or whatever else. And even when there was a much larger population of stay-at-home moms, they were communicating with each other and involved in education. And there was an entire world of child rearing and early education and taking care of the home and family that men were not privy to and had no control over and were viewed as outsiders in. And so it's weird because it's like she's viewing everything from her perspective and she's giving males way more credit than they have. She's looking at the male group and saying that is society and they view us as others. That is not society. Society includes your group. You are the other half of society. And males could easily make arguments that you view males as other. And I think the reason for this is it's odd for me to say this as a capitalist, but Marxists, socialists tend to be oddly obsessed with money. It's like they're really, really obsessed with who has money. Money is like the driving force of everything for them. And that's, I think, an unhealthy and distorted view of the universe. There are lots of...
They say power, but I think a big part of what they mean is money.
Word. What does power mean? Yeah. Women have the power to reject sexual partners much more than men do, right? It's always the men who did the like courting and the women who said yes or no. That's a power that is in women's camp. Women know they have sexual power. I mean, no woman doesn't know that she has a lot of sexual power out in the world against men. If she wants to use it against men, she can. I mean, maybe some of these feminists don't know this, which actually is one of the by the way, one of the things I like about her. What did she call? She said lesbians occurred. I'm sure the third waivers hate this, and I don't agree with this. It's just funny. Lesbians are what happens when women are unattractive and malformed. They turn to lesbianism. That's an aside. I just thought it was funny.
That's what the SJWs would call problematic.
Of course. Yes. I mean, it's wrong. I disagree with her, but...
Yeah, this is a foundational text. However...
yeah, however, not that one. Anyway, do you understand what I'm saying about like the perspectives here and why there's this maniacal obsession with, quote, power, but power can be defined how you want it to be defined.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I agree with you. They say power, but they often, what they mean is, a big part of what they mean by power is financial power,
right? Or political power. I'll grant them that.
Political power, finance,
is more raw power. That's true. But you know, once we reach a point in society where we agree, all of us, men and women both, and trans people, that political power should not be exercised differently based on your gender, that argument goes out. You can't then complain about political power after that. Then now you have to complain about some other kind of, quote, power. And I think that's largely economic. And you can see from her writing that she's very focused on economic, and she is dismissive and derisive in her description of staying home, having children, raising children, educating children, being a mom. She seems to view that with a great amount of contempt, from what I can tell.
Yeah, well, a lot of times I find these texts, these people who are arguing against racism or against sexism, but from this ideology, to be very racist and sexist towards the people they're supposedly defending. So just like with the Peggy McIntosh white privilege knapsack, and as we're reading it, it's like, wow, you hold a lot of racist assumptions about Black people. You're not really painting a great picture of Black people here. The same could be said for Simone in some of this, because she basically, she's kind of like, well, biology we haven't risen beyond biology, and the only way to achieve meaning in life is to rise above the animal kingdom and to not let biology limit us. And men have done that. She's like, men have gone on to create things and you know, have contributed to society and inventions and blah, 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 blah. And women have maintained this passive role tied to childbirth and caretaking. And as she's painting this picture, I'm like, she even says, she talks about how Freud says that women view themselves as a damaged version of men, and that she doesn't disagree with that, but she says that it's society that causes us to view ourselves as damaged versions of men. Well, I don't view myself as a damaged version of a man. Like, what this picture that you're painting of women is not very flattering. It's kind of sexist. I guess that's my point.
Oh, yeah. I was surprised at how anti-female she seemed to be, Keri. I mean, just to be clear, she does go through, she goes through Freud and Plato and Hegel and some poetry and some fiction authors. And she spends the first part of her treatise here basically poking holes in things they have to say or their conception of sex in society. And some of what she has to say is correct. Like she's accurately identifying problems with their thought process. So that's fine. But she herself, I mean, at the end of the second volume, she talks about how women are narcissists and horrible in all these ways. And I'm shocked that this is where she's going. She's saying all these things about women that she would be executed for today. And then she says, but it's men's fault that women are these ways because something or other, they have jobs, basically. I mean, there's not really, because women have to bear children and it's men's fault. I wasn't clear. Do you know why it's men's fault exactly? Can you explain exactly why it's men's fault, Keri?
Again, it's just because she has the belief that if there are two groups and one has some type of advantage, and she views the fact that men have, according to her, escaped their biology, I guess, that they have an advantage, then that necessarily means they are oppressors of the other group. But if you don't believe that, then this entire thing falls apart. It's not the fault of this particular group that this other group hasn't achieved the same goals that you would like to see them achieve. Like, and again, I agree with her in a lot. At the time, there were a lot of social reasons why women were not going into the workforce to the same degree as men or going to college. And definitely there were ideas about what roles men and women should fulfill in society. I just don't agree with her that those are entirely socially constructed. And that,
well, there's a difference between arguing for setting up a culture that allows people the freedom to do what they want and setting up a culture that is angry when they choose things you don't like. For example, so she argues that, for example, in one spot, that girls play with dolls because of a whole bunch of social science crap about socialization and blah, 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 right? And she argues that, that children only differentiate because of social interactions, social pressure. That's just factually inaccurate. That's factually untrue. You can take a newborn baby. They've done these studies. You can take a newborn baby. Newborn females are more interested in looking at faces. Newborn males are more interested in looking at things. There are differences in personality. There are preference differences between the genders in general. Again,
on average.
It can't be outliers. It doesn't mean blah, blah, blah. But right. On average, there are differences. And
well, the same thing. There was a study with the capuchin monkeys. You know about this one. I think it was baby capuchin monkeys. They would give them trucks or dolls, and the female baby monkeys preferred to play with dolls, and the male baby monkeys preferred to play with trucks. Right. And they're not living in some social construction of human invention.
Right. They haven't risen above their animal nature.
Yes.
So kind of by definition. Yeah, but it's this difference between, she conflates this idea of not prejudging someone because of their gender and saying they can't do something with the expectation that women would naturally be men and men would be women if it weren't for, men being pigs, which is, I'm summarizing, but if you had to give us kind of a summary of what her overarching argument and call to action is here, what would you say it is, Keri?
Well, after she ends with, like you said, talking about how because they're not allowed to be treated as individuals like men are and like children are, women are treated as roles like wife or mother, and that this makes them neurotic and narcissistic. And she goes into how awful they are, like you said. At the end, she's kind of like, well, if we open up on a positive note, if we open up the roles that we allow women to play, then that will go a long way towards making them free and making them, I guess she doesn't, like you said, she's not pushing happiness, but I think that's kind of implied here, even though she says that's not what she's talking about.
Well, because that's what people actually care about.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So because she says women are limited, we don't allow women to like be innovative and to produce work and to be individuals and to be someone outside of these roles as they relate to men. We don't allow them to be anything but wife or mother or sex object. This is her belief. And because of that, they're oppressed, they're not free. And so we have to open up these roles. Again, I don't disagree with her on the broad strokes, because again, we're talking about 1949. And we did open up those roles of what was acceptable for women to do. I guess one of my thoughts about that now, though, what'd you say?
Sorry, I agree that there was problems and that some of those are real things, but I still disagree with her approach of creating a gender war, which is basically even the language she used. She kind of believes that we're at war.
Yeah, we're at war, and also just the whole idea of oppression. I don't view hierarchies as necessarily always being about corruption or oppression. And I also don't believe that because one group has a certain type of advantage that another group doesn't have, that means that this group doesn't have advantages that this group doesn't have. There have been advantages to these hierarchies for both, and there have been marginalizations, disadvantages to both.
Yeah.
And so,
in fact, at one point she says they expect all women to be altruistic in ways that are not required of men, and we could easily flip that on its head and say, well, if there's a sinking ship, who is it that goes first? Oh, is it men? Is it men first? Is that the motto? I forget. Is it who goes to war and sacrifices their lives to protect you? Is that women? Right? So she cherry picks things that women are pressured to be altruistic about and ignores things that men are pressured to be altruistic about. Again, it's this weird one-sided view of the universe rather than a view based around achieving equal moral status without necessarily having the exact same implementation of how people choose to live that status, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can choose to be a career woman and not have children and build a successful company, and the path should be open to you there. People shouldn't say you can't do it because you're a woman. They shouldn't treat you differently because you're a woman. They shouldn't not invest in you or scoff at you or whatever because you're a woman. On the flip side, if you go home and say, I would rather stay home and raise children because actually raising the next generation is one of the most crucial and important roles that society has, and it's more valuable than building a fucking shoe business or whatever the hell I was going to do. I'm going to do that because that's more important in the long run. Well, you can't marginalize, you can't criticize that. You can't say that's not her, living her power and expressing her desires and having the freedom to do what she wants. That is the freedom to do what she wants. Sometimes women, if they have agency, which they do, will choose things that feminists don't want them to choose.
I have to say, I just looked in the chat real quick, and somebody quoted Bill Burr back when before he became, I think Bill Burr has become kind of an SJW comedian now, which is amazing, but because he was so anti that for a while. But anyway, he just quoted Bill Burr, "There are no feminists in a house fire."
That is true. That is true. In fact, for those of us who are in relationships, often if there's a large spider, there are no feminists.
Hey.
But the other, and another interesting thing that she did, as I said, she was, pitting the sexes against each other. We talked about this, the othering. she went through, it looks like she did a pretty thorough review of lots of different societies in history and called out some admittedly, misogynistic or bad behavior. Like I said, cherry picking though. But she also even criticizes the people who worship women. So she cites a tribe. She talks about some authors, and she basically also argues that, well, by worshiping women and putting them up on this pedestal and thinking they're great, that makes them the other. And so you're still guilty of all of their problems. In fact, she ties that one to narcissism as well. Like, you've made them neurotic and horrible because you've worshipped them. And it's this, from a guy's perspective, I can't imagine being a guy in her life who actually was trying to be what nowadays we would consider normal and treating her with equality. I can't imagine being a guy in her life, because it seems like anything you did would be, you're too nice to me. That's hurting me. That's oppressive. You're too mean to me. That's oppressive. Like, what's not oppressive at this point? Only what? I'm not sure what's not oppressive in her view. It seems like everything is oppressive.
Everything. Well, yeah, to go back, it necessarily is oppressive because she viewed men as being the group with advantages. And so therefore the other group is necessarily the one with disadvantages. They have this very simple binary in SJW ideology where they put everyone into these groups. It's like, you are oppressed or you're the oppressor. There's no gray area. You are marginalized or you're privileged. And that's right. It. And so it's funny, the thing we were talking about, you and I, oh gosh, what was it we were talking about, where I didn't notice the sleight of hand, where they went from talking about the privileged to talking about the oppressor, and you noticed it. But see, I didn't notice it because they use those words interchangeably all the time. And she used that was Peggy McIntosh. Yeah. So if you are advantaged, as Simone says, or privileged, then necessarily they take that leap and call you an oppressor. Right.
She also, she makes another point, which I think, well, it really bothers me as well, because I know there's a lot of women who are, well, I'll call them, without removing agency, I'll call them victims of second wave feminism, who get past the childbearing age and are sad that they never had children, and they've got another 30, 40, 50 years of their life to go, right?
I've talked with some of these women. We're going to do a whole episode on this.
Yes, I think we should. But de Beauvoir basically said, she laments that old women are faced with a lot of regrets. And she claims, I don't think it's just anecdotal. Like a lot of this stuff, there's anecdotal. She has one thing where there's a survey of some people, but like almost all of this is just her own lived experience. But she says she laments that these old women they have regrets for not being able to accomplish things beyond marriage and having kids, and that makes them generally frustrated. But and maybe that's true. I don't know. I would think if that's the situation, then they should probably readjust their blueprint, because being in a loving marriage and raising great children is, frankly, if that's all I accomplish on my deathbed, I hope that I'm not frustrated and sad, even though I am trying to do other things. But that's very valuable. She doesn't talk about the flip side, which these second wave feminists never talked about the flip side of that, which is, well, not having children when you're in your old age is even more depressing to many women. Not every woman. Some women, they've got their international law firm that they founded and they run it till they're 94 and die. That's fine. But other women, many other women, buy into this idea that marriage, as de Beauvoir seems to characterize marriage is oppression, and being a mother isn't enough. It's not sufficient to, I don't know, become self-actualized or whatever it is. And so they shun that in their youth, when their opportunity to get married is and have children is at its peak. And then when it passes by, at least the opportunity to have children passes by, they regret it. And no second wave feminist that I'm aware of says, hey, you know what? There's this other side of the equation here. Yes, you should go have a career and not feel held back if that's what you want to do. Also, if you choose to be a mom, that's a great thing. And actually raising children is super, super important. And I think the reason that she wants socialism is she wants to free women from the burden of ever having to raise children, and she wants the state to raise them.
I think that is maybe an unexamined motivation for a lot of feminist thought. Yes, that they, because she talks about rising above the biology. Well, how do you rise above the biology? If you're a woman, you have to be separated from the product of reproduction, of actual caretaking for children. And it's, I don't know. Here's my issue with it, and I think we touched on this just a little bit, but I'm glad the second wave feminist revolution happened. Of course I am. It opened up opportunities for me and for other women. You know, I wouldn't want to be living during a time when it's frowned upon for a woman to pursue art or career or, you know, whatever makes her an individual. So, but at the same time, I noticed there's this hesitancy to look at the consequences of things sometimes. And so, as you pointed out, women are reporting that they're unhappy in larger numbers than they were during the 60s and 70s. And so what is that about? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily as a result of these changing social expectations or opportunities, but why are we not examining that? And the other thing I think is that a lot of times when they talk about people being oppressed, I think what they're really just doing is they're mistaking the condition of life. Like life is oppressive at times.
Often suffering at times. Yeah.
Yeah. And so to say that is it's a result of, it's a unique thing to women because they're in this category without advantages. And if only we could get them out from under the foot of the man who by nature of his advantages makes him an oppressor. If only we could do that, then they would be happy. And it's like, well, we've done that, and women can be whatever they want, and they're actually unhappier. So there's an element of unhappiness to life.
That's part of the human experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
I joke with my wife sometimes when I'm having a bad day. I joke with her and say, you know, if I were religious, I would believe that God hates me today. Like it would just there. We have times in our lives where it just seems like the universe is against us and we're oppressed by everything and everyone around us. And sometimes there's maybe some grains of truth to parts of that, but it's not unique to women. It's that's being a human. It
is against you. It's trying to kill you. You're going to die.
Yeah, well, yes, actually, nature does hate you. That's one of my. In fact, this is a geeky, but it's geeky and a little bit personal about my family, but I'll share it anyway. So I grew up in a very religious home, and we said grace every night. But we're all atheists in my family right now, and but I like the idea of like a family table and maybe thanking each other or being thankful for food or whatever. So we came up with a little prayer. It's not really a prayer. It's a poem to thank the people who invented all of the ways to beat back nature from trying to kill us. And like,
I love this.
Like nature is our enemy. Thank you, all these people who figured out how to like rip corn from the ground and make vegetables and fruit and like do all these things and give us a roof. Like all these inventions, these great inventions and this great progress from humankind. That's in response to the very real fact that, you know, if it's just you and nature, you die alone naked in the cold or eaten by a tiger. Like that's how nature works. So yeah, humans rise above nature because of our brains. Our tool of survival is rational thought and beating back nature. But Yeah, someone just wrote the origins of feminism, pure hatred of men. It does seem like that, right? Because even though there's truth to what she's saying on some of these aspects, like no one wants the Mad Men world back, right? No, I mean maybe there are a few misogynists in the world who wish that workplaces were like Mad Men, but no one really wants that. People have all accepted this idea that yeah, we should be treated equally. We recognize that that's righteous and that's just, and let's leave it at that. But this is not driven completely by that. I think her approach here demonstrates that she's using very real problems to push an anti-male agenda and blame males for everything. And the fact that you can blame males who worship women for women's narcissism is, I think, basically all the evidence you need to convict de Beauvoir of this crime.
Yeah. As we're reading this, it made me think of, I don't know if people stay and watch at the end of our daily Covfefe videos, we do kind of a joke. We read some SJW text as a sacrifice to the Google AI overlords. Please don't delete our channel. Because it grows out of a joke that Carter was making about how they're training, which they're training AI to go in and automatically flag certain content, and they're doing it with a room full of SJWs deciding what's acceptable and what's not. So anyway, we started reading different SJW texts at the end, and I started reading. This is a book I read in my women's studies program, Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. Now, this is it's a manifesto, and it's, as manifestos go, it's a crazy one. They're pretty crazy usually. But there's a reason we read it in women's studies class. It actually, even though she's using very coarse, crass language of the time, this echoes a lot of the feminist theory we were reading. It's just taken to an extreme, and it's voiced in a really crass way. And so as we were reading this, I noticed Simone de Beauvoir was saying, women view themselves as damaged versions of men, that society teaches them this. And so all these things that she's saying about women, which is just so that's a horribly sexist way to look at women. Valerie Solanas takes a bunch of that and flips it on its head and truly writes this about men. She's like, men are incomplete females. She calls men a walking abortion, aborted at the gene stage, because, yeah. So it's
and that Y chromosome.
Yeah, right. So if you take all of these things that she's saying about women, damaged versions of men, narcissistic, obsessed with themselves, and just horribly sexist, I think, to view women as that, but then to flip it this way and make it about men, it's just, I don't know, it's kind of interesting.
Well, by the way, I should clarify, Good Boy said, I bet that first family dinner with your fiance at the time was interesting. It's my wife and I who introduced I'm not talking about my family of origin. They don't do the new, thank you for beating back nature. My family of origin is still Christian. I'm talking about my family now. But Keri, let's, I know we wanted to go over kind of, I don't know if you feel we've done a good enough job of, maybe we have we given a kind of good overview of who Simone de Beauvoir was and kind of what the overview of what her message was really? I don't think we've left anything out.
No,
but
I mean, it's a very brief overview. If you guys get a chance, and now I want to go back and reread the whole book because just to familiarize myself with it. But just know that some of these concepts you're hearing about, they have very deep roots. So as Carter said, this whole idea of lived experience being somehow just as important, or now we're seeing it being offered up as even more important than facts and argumentation. That was in this 1949 book. She talked about lived experience. And this whole concept of the other is something else that you will see in a lot of different feminist writing or SJW writing. And I think she can be credited with popularizing that.
Yeah. And I think just using the wrong standards to judge the world. I mean, to quote her, this world has always belonged to males, and none of the reasons given for this have ever seemed sufficient. The world has not always belonged to males. a lot of land has belonged to males. A lot of the workplace has belonged to males, like it belonged in the sense that it was predominantly populated by males. But that's not the world. That is not the world. That is one aspect of the world. And it's important. But frankly, I think one of the ways in which we've gone horribly wrong in society is, and maybe we can blame second wave feminism for this, we have ignored the very important task of raising children. We've largely ignored it. And now we have children who are basically zombies programmed by educators / the state who have no idea how to critically think.
/ pharmaceutical companies.
/ pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, the state. I mean, go back some time and look at a high school examination from the 1800s. Most people with college degrees couldn't even get half of the questions right. Right? The amount of lowering of standards and the morphing of, creative, thoughtful, critical individual minds into drones has occurred, I think, partly because, not completely, but partly because we've not bothered to care too much about raising children. It doesn't mean, obviously, it's not everyone. I mean, there's been lots of brilliant people, and there continue to be lots of brilliant, creative, smart, critical thinking people inventing things and doing stuff. But on the whole, I think there's been a decline. Let's kind of shift a little bit, because part of this is, we're talking about this kind of foundation of second wave feminism. How does some of this relate to the social justice movement that we talk about all the time? And I know parts of it don't. So, for example, they hate her concept of homosexuality. Mm-hmm. And they would claim that she's a homophobe, or I don't think did she even talk about trans stuff at all, other than to mention that there were hermaphrodites?
No, not that I recall. But this became the basis of this idea that sex is a social construct, became the basis of a lot of what we now see trans ideology. So these things always piggyback on the previous one. It's always like, well, so-and-so had this right, but they didn't take it far enough and they didn't extend it to these groups. And so this is a foundational text that then people have expounded on. And the way it's related is I would say the most obvious way is that she puts people into groups and then assumes that one is necessarily oppressing the other and that one is oppressed. And so that is the basis of SJW ideology, which is they view the world as a place of competition between groups, and those groups they define based on identity. And so they've just taken this, men and women, and they've expanded upon it. And so they have the race, like black and white, or they have size, and now you've got fat studies, and the people of size are the oppressed, and average size people are the oppressors. Or they've extended it out to sexuality, they've extended it to trans stuff, they've extended it to religion. I've even seen people extend it to, we talked about to mental disorders, and it's never ending, but it's all viewed in the same way of like, one of these groups is necessarily oppressing the other one. And that's not the case. I don't believe that to be the case. And,
well, and it's inherently collectivist, right? Because it's groups don't oppress each other, individuals oppress each other, right? Like groups don't act really. I mean, yes, there's a summation of actions of an individual in a group, but individuals act, not groups. And not all men were oppressing all women, even when she wrote this. And very few today are oppressing women. So one criticism I've seen of her is by the intersectional ideologues, who argue that, she understood, because she actually talks about some of these groups. She compares women to blacks and Native Americans and other, quote, marginalized classes of people. I think it was I think she viewed them as classes. But their criticism as well, she didn't see how they intersect. So being a Black woman is, I don't know if they have math associated with, I don't know if is that the square of being a woman and being Black? Is it oppression squared, or is it oppression times 2? I don't know. But certainly this concept of intersectionality allows for the stacking of these groups. And one thing she didn't do was stack these.
Well, and there's like you said, there is no complicated equation there. There's nothing more complicated to intersectionality than them saying, I can rack up more oppressed group statuses than you. That's it. It's the belief that the more of these marginalized groups you belong to, necessarily the more oppressed you are. And the more of these privileged or oppressor groups you belong to, that necessarily the more of an oppressor you are. So you can't say this is why it doesn't make any sense. But take a mentally ill, homeless white guy. They would still say he's an oppressor. Like, it doesn't matter his situation, or it doesn't matter which of these, he does belong to some marginalized groups if he's homeless and if he has mental illness or whatever, but overall he belongs to these big oppressor groups, like the ones in their hierarchy.
More points for being in one versus the other.
Yeah, you get more points for being in some. Yeah. Definitely. And that's all intersectionality is. And there is no equation. And that's why you can stump them by asking questions about, like, well, like I saw a friend of mine yesterday was like, I'm half white and half Black. Like, how many points do I get in each category? How do you judge me?
Right.
Guess what? Maybe we shouldn't be judging and ranking people based on race and sex.
Right.
It's a little complicated.
From what I can tell, it looks like second wave feminism took this work and did the opposite of what they should have done, right? The right thing to do would have been to take this work and say, well, here are some valid things that she's addressing. Let's focus on how to address those things and put them in a framework that is rational. But she made these other errors. So let's ignore these errors, and let's not create a war between the genders. And there isn't this sex isn't a social construct, and here are her errors. We'll ignore the errors and we'll focus on the parts that she kind of got right or semi-right. It seems like they did the opposite, and they were like, we'll ignore the parts that she maybe did okay on, and we're just going to focus on the errors. We need more errors.
That's a funny way of looking at it.
I don't know. That was my interpretation.
Yeah. There's interesting discussion going on in the chat, by the way.
You look. What's going on? Business isn't a Western world invention. I would agree. I don't know who's arguing. Business. I actually.
Somebody was saying.
Says it the best way that I've heard. Like, capitalism isn't invented. Businesses aren't invented. That's just the natural state of man. You do something and you barter with your neighbor about it. Like, that's all capitalism is. So.
Okay, but somebody's saying that business, as it currently exists in the Western world, was developed by and for men. I would agree with that.
I would disagree with that.
Really?
I would say no, because would I agree that it was. So first of all, we have to define what we mean by business as it currently exists. I assume what they mean by that is, incorporation laws and the idea of having a company and blah, blah, blah. Like, I assume they mean the legal structure around a business, because businesses have existed forever in the kind of philosophical sense. So I assume they mean the legal structure of a business. That was created by men because men were creating the legal structures. To say it was created for men implies that it was created with the intent of excluding non-men intentionally, and I don't know the evidence for that. I think it is created, but not for a particular sex. It happens to be a tool used mostly by the male sex, but it wasn't created for them, right? There weren't company charters that were like, you know, women suck and men are awesome, and you know what, like there wasn't. That's not built in. Let me see what the response is.
Well, this isn't a value judgment on men creating it for men. I think it's just, I think this.
Oh, I see the argument. It's not made for women because women have babies and babies puts a monkey wrench in the works. Yeah, but I don't think that's a function of how they're created. I think that's a function of the fact, like you can say the same thing about the hunter-gatherer cultures. Like hunting was created for men. It's like, no, men are just better for going hunting because they don't have to stay home and breastfeed. Like there wasn't it's not like people got together and said, let's figure out a way to get a high calorie count that excludes women. I know, hunting. Like it wasn't created. It was just men are more, in general, men have historically been more in a position and to do that more, right? It's like saying breastfeeding was created, like child rearing is created for women.
Talking about how it came to be. It was created for men because they were the ones doing it. Do you see what I'm saying?
It was created for men? No, I don't understand. I would agree it's created by men. But I don't know. I don't know what for men means. I don't think men did this for themselves. I think they did it. I don't think men did this with sex in mind. I don't know. Look, if there's evidence that
I think the word for here is tripping us up because it's would men and women
benefit of.
Right. Okay. Well, that's not the way I guess that's not the way I'm interpreting it.
Well, maybe there needs to be a clarification. So I don't know. And I know this person in the chat is not a crazy person. She's someone that we talk to often who's got her head screwed on straight. So maybe there's a miscommunication on terms. But you know, my point here is just the idea that it was this like that Western culture is this sexual or not sexual sexist cabal of men. Like I know we'll build banks. In fact, that'll screw with them.
That's not what she's saying. So
no, I'm not saying she's saying that.
I know. So we agree. So we all agree then. That's not what she's saying.
Yeah, I know.
It's the word for. Yeah. So see, she said it's the word for that's tripping us up. Anyway, this is enough minutia of the chat. I'm enjoying it, but
I'm enjoying it too. But that's fine.
I have to go to a place of business now.
How dare you?
So.
Wait, do you have to leave right now, or should we do like a quick? Is there anything else you want to say about how this relates to social justice?
No, I said it before you got into the chat.
Okay, so you're done with the relation to social justice.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, I can be.
Final point?
No, it can be a shorter episode. I can be done with it. I would like people to tell us if they want us to move it to a different day, if they like or don't like this, because most of the people in the chat are people who are regular listeners. So, and yes, C Brown, who I know your name's not Charlie because I know you're a woman, but I read that as Charlie Brown in my head all the time. We will, maybe I'll read the chat and try and figure out what you're saying. I'm reading bits and pieces because I'm multitasking, and I am horrible at multitasking. So, as Keri can attest to, I think. All right. Well, that was cool. That was Simone de Beauvoir. The book is called The Second Sex, and it was published in 1949. It was one of the foundations of second wave feminism, and that's where we see a lot of these lived experience. And as Keri pointed out, gender as a social construct or sex as a social construct, a lot of that stuff is in here. So this is not new. But
some light reading. We'll add it to. We could add this to our way down the road, our book club. By the way, book club guys, first week of August.
Yes.
You better get on it. Brave New World.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keri. I'm sorry that you have to go out into the oppressive capitalist workforce.
I'm going to a place that's designed for men. Truly.
There are places designed for men.
Cool.
Yes. Yes. Many of them are not. All right. Later, Keri.
Bye.
Bye.
Wait a minute. That sounds like I'm going to a strip club.
Oh. No, everyone. Keri does not work at a strip club. All the guys in the audience like, oh, what strip club is that?
See you later. Gotta go make that money.
Where are my singles? Yeah, it's not,
Okay.
not that. Wait. I thought of one thing as we were joking about this. A point that I want to make. Many of the labor-saving devices that the quote misogynist patriarchal society invented as industry was being was coming into its own, and we were figuring out more mechanical devices and that kind of thing. Most of the first ones, not most, but like a lot of these they invented labor-saving devices for women first, right? Dishwashers came before safety equipment for coal miners. Like there was a lot of things that this quote oppressive patriarchal society did in terms of taking that creative and inventive power, these things that were supposedly made for men, and giving it as gifts to women, which I'm sure Simone would view as viewing women as the other and putting them on a pedestal and therefore being responsible for all their narcissism.
And by the way, and tying them to domesticity is what
ties them. Yeah. But since you don't have to do the dishes anymore, now you're more tied to the domesticity. I don't understand that argument too much, but I think she blames men for the blasé. She blames men, I think, for the fact that as society progressed and standard of living rose, women had less to do and were bored. That's men's fault, I think, also. Seems like. But anyway, on that note, go to your strip club. I mean, you're a totally legitimate place of work, Keri. We'll see everyone next week.
Bye, guys. Thanks for tuning in.